we go.
Okay, here we go. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. As we said, for those of you that are here today and not watching the big Rams game, although I'm not a big NFL watcher either, I am kind of hoping the Rams win. But we're super excited to host this EV seminar with everybody today, specifically in Palms, as a very dense multi-unit, neighborhood. We want to dive into possibly, looking at Palms in as an example of how we can get EV chargers in our apartment buildings and in our infrastructure here locally in a neighborhood like Palms. And there's lots of neighborhoods like Palms in LA. So I'm here tonight with my co-host of the Green Committee, Helen Taco. My name is Jesselyn Waldron. We both co-chair the Green Committee of the Palms Neighborhood Council. You can find info on our Green Committee meetings if you want to participate further in stuff that we do, and we do a lot, on the palmsla.nc website. Did I say that right, Helen?
palmsnc.la.
Thank you. And then, so we're happy to be, partnering with Charles Miller. He, with this event, and sorry, I lost my train of thought. He is the original founder of the Green Committee. I think it was 12 years ago, Charles? Something like that?
13 now, I think, but yeah. Since
original.
Yeah,
original co-founder, the guy that laid the work for Helen and I to be able to do all the great work we do in Palms in the greater city of LA. So we're excited to be hosting this EV seminar with Charles and to learn more about EV chargers in Palms. A little bit about Charles before we get started, just so you guys know a little bit more about him. He is also the creator of the LA Native Coalition. He's a member of LA City Council Biodiversity LA panel, Westwood Greenway Board, and a producer of numerous award-winning film projects for film and TV, and soon will be a USGBC Lead Green Associate, as well as certified with the UCLA Sustainability Program. That's just a few bullet points of all of the work that Charles did. So we're really excited to work with him and have him here and learn from him tonight. So also feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go, and we'll flag them for Charles. And we will have a Q&A after the presentation to kind of dive into the topic a little deeper. And I'll kick it over to Helen or Charles. Helen, did I miss anything?
Nope, I think that sounded great.
Okay, and then I guess we'll kick it to Charles. We'll get started.
All right, Jesselyn, Helen, thank you very much. I just want to start by thanking Palms Neighborhood Council for embracing this. I brought this idea to these two ladies, and they kind of took a leap of faith with me and got involved in what we're doing here. I want to be very clear that I am not an absolute expert in the area of, I'm not an electrician. I do know, as an amateur, I know a fair amount on this subject. And I have worked in dealing with HOAs and things like that, and buildings and management and things like that. So I'm familiar with the circumstances involved. I've worked with people in LADWP and all kinds of things to get the information right on this. But anything you hear today, we're not giving you an absolute guarantee that it's a certainty. You need to verify, things otherwise, especially technical information. But in general, I feel comfortable that what we're telling you is correct. But I want to thank everybody for coming. We'd had like 20 people sign up, 19 people sign up. So we expected this to be a fairly small group because it's the first one we're doing. And so we're kind of learning as we go in terms of the format. What I'd spoken when I was speaking a few minutes ago with Helen and Jesselyn, we decided to keep it open at all times, questions. So there's a question box and you can submit questions, and Helen will be monitoring that. If it's germane to something that we're talking about at that moment, Helen's going to interrupt me and we can extrapolate on those questions. If it's just a broader question that doesn't apply to what we're specifically discussing at that moment, we'll do an open Q&A at the end, and anybody can ask anything you want. And we'll probably stay as long as you want in terms of your questions, because there aren't that many of you, and we really appreciate you coming. Our goal here is to promote sustainability, and everybody here, just to be clear, is an absolute volunteer. No one's getting paid to do this. We're doing it because we care about these issues, and we hope that you do too. And thank you for coming. So I'm going to dump this now to sharing the screen, and we should get what's going on. a second here. How about now? Do you guys, everybody see a screen that says EV charger, small multifamily residential buildings?
Looks good.
All right. So again, I'm gonna just poke through stuff as it comes up in the order of this presentation, but please ask questions if you have them, because that'll make the whole thing more interactive and more engaging. So this seminar, and this is a guide essentially for owners, managers of small multifamily rental communities. That's HOA officers, people who live in condo communities, anybody who drives an EV or is curious about driving an EV in the future, or really anybody who's kind of interested in being a sustainability advocate. They're all are welcome here. I know Jesselyn mentioned earlier that our focus is going to be on Los Angeles, and that's true. I know some of the people already in the chat room are not Los Angeles locals. So keep in mind that our information when we talk about LA City stuff might be a little bit different for your area, but a lot of the principles and a lot of the stuff that we're going to be discussing should apply to stuff that happens anywhere. And hopefully if you don't have the answer you need here, we can help you find it, or we can point you to somebody who can. So EVs are kind of the coming revolution. I've been heavily involved in sustainability movement and civic movement as an advocate in different things. And I want to be very clear before going any further that I am not one of these people that thinks that the only solutions out there are to drive cars. I'm very much involved in better infrastructure for bikes, for pedestrians, for any kind of public transportation that's easy to use, safe and clean, and meets the agenda of what people are doing, get people on bikes to make them healthier. All those things are great. However, the automobile, especially in Western culture and extra especially in the United States, is central to our culture and to our life experience here and our infrastructure. And it would be naive of us to think that we could just snap a finger and everybody's going to walk and take a bike everywhere. So we need to, in addition to creating those other better options, we need to figure out how to make the automobile the best it can be for our future. And thankfully, I think 2021 kind of was a tipping point year in terms of the culture starting to get the idea that the EV is coming and that this is where we're going to be going, and that this has to be a necessary part of our global effort to address the climate crisis. If you look at greenhouse gas emissions globally, the number one cause to them is the transportation sector. And in the United States, the number one contributor to greenhouse gas emissions within the transportation sector is the automobile or SUV or truck, but basically the single person's small vehicle. I don't mean small compared to, I mean small compared to heavy duty vehicle, light duty vehicles that we all use to drive around town and those things. Those are the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions, and EVs eliminate that entirely. Yes, we can make an argument about how you get your energy and how things are produced, but even in the absolute worst situation where all your energy is coming from a coal plant and the manufacturer isn't all that responsible, even in those situations, it's still much better to drive an EV in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. And that worst case scenario, that's quickly becoming a thing of the past as we move to cleaner renewable energy as part of our electricity infrastructure and as part of what we're doing to address climate crisis on a larger scale. So by 2030, 50% of new US auto sales should be EVs. That's the federal goal, and they're setting up incentives to do that. We can get into a protracted discussion about Build Back Better and Joe Manchin, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. And there's legislation that's still being fought over that will create different levels of incentive that haven't happened as of yet. However, that is the federal goal. And in California, there's a goal to have 100% of new automobile sales to be EVs by 2035. And in fact, California is actually making that a restriction. So as opposed to just a goal at the federal level, it's a restriction. The good news is that the automobile industry has, for the most part, maybe the exceptions being Toyota and Honda who are still dragging their feet, for the most part, the automobile industry has got this now. And they are heavily investing in EVs and heavily investing in a future that is predominantly EVs. And many automobile manufacturers have announced that they will only be selling EVs well before that 2035 deadline. So the truth is EVs are coming. And just in 2021, a survey showed that over half of new car buyers, even by 2021 standards, are considering EVs. And huge, amazing statistic for you. In Europe in 2021, the number one selling car was the Tesla Model 3, which is 100% EV. And that's the first time ever that an EV is led in Europe, but it's also the first time ever that a car that wasn't made in Europe actually led there. And for those of you who are from Europe and want to promote Europe, they're building a factory in Germany. So there's going to be plenty of European made EVs from Tesla, and there are already a bunch from other manufacturers. Also, right now in California, the Tesla EVs are the number one selling cars, and that's including internal combustion engine vehicles. So my point is EVs are coming. They're coming, and they're coming in a big way. And it's important that we be ready for that as they arrive. Home charging is the number one factor connected to EV owner satisfaction. And I'll give you an example of this. In early 2010s, there were a lot of people who became early adopters of EVs, and they bought it. What was studied by, I think UC Davis did a study on this, and what they determined is that 1 in 5 people who bought an EV in those early days, and keep in mind, these were overpriced vehicles that didn't have much range and had a lot more compromises than EVs do today. But the number one reason that 1 in 5 people switched back to an internal combustion vehicle after buying an EV was that they didn't have home charging. And very, very few people who have home charging ever switch back. An EV is cleaner, it does a whole bunch of things, and we'll discuss some of those things in a second. Small multifamily housing in Los Angeles. So here's the tie-in of all this stuff. Most people in LA live in multifamily housing. And in fact, the most common type of housing facility building in Los Angeles is a small multifamily building. And I'm calling that SMF just for the sake of our slides here. That's not any particular legal term or magical term. And also for the purposes of this discussion, I'm referring to buildings between 5 and 25 units, but that's only because that's just where I needed a metric for whenever I pull out statistics. But this stuff kind of applies to buildings with 2, 3, 4 units and buildings with 30 units. It all applies in different ways depending on the metrics that are involved. 64% of small multifamily buildings that are in Los Angeles, that's these 5 to 25 units, were constructed prior to 1970. So that's a lot if you think about it. In a vast, massive city in Los Angeles, we have a lot of these old buildings. And you're familiar with the type, the mid-century looking bungalow type kind of building that either has an interior courtyard, or maybe it's all just one apartment building, but it's a fairly small kind of a thing. A lot of times these buildings don't have on-site management, or if they do, it's somebody who just lives there who gets like a little bit of a take in order to kind of do some collecting of rent and things like that. But they're not big facilities where there is a corporate entity involved generally who has on-site management to take care of problems. And the most telling thing about these buildings in terms of the challenges they will face for EV chargers is that they have legacy electric infrastructure. So these buildings were not built with their own power systems, their own power supply, power infrastructure, like a massive apartment building often has its own, separate power facility. These kind of buildings don't have that. They have an older infrastructure that is often dated, and it's often right now pushing maximum load capacity, which makes expansion to suddenly plug in a bunch of cars that take a lot of juice potentially very complicated. But it is worth the effort for both owners, residents, and advocates, and all of us to actually push to get EV chargers into these type of buildings. Not only because it's the most common type of building, and we can't leave this out of the equation if we're actually going to address greenhouse gas emissions, but because just the act of putting home charging into a facility leads more people to buy EVs. They see it, they see their neighbor buying an EV, they see the benefits that that neighbor experiences having an EV, and they also realize it's much easier than having to bother to go to a gas station and having to deal with all the cost of maintenance of combustion engine vehicles. EV drivers are invested in community and social responsibility. Just by definition, at least at this point in the adoption curve, EV drivers tend to be people who are more interested in social and civic engagement, because they are the kind of people who are thinking about what they're doing when they put gas in their car every time and thinking about the consequences of driving. Now, eventually, 25 years from now, everyone will be driving an EV and there won't be many internal combustion engine vehicles left. So those kind of things become less over time. But right now, it's a great way to engage with people who are actually very civically minded. There are no oil and transmission fluid leaks. This means a cleaner garage that's easy to maintain for owners, and it's healthier for residents. Fewer slip and fall risks, fewer messes, less risk to pets that might get out and get involved in a toxic liquid. It's a cleaner vehicle, and it's desirable to have in your building, whether you're a neighbor or you're a building owner, just because an EV is a better resident than an ICE vehicle. I'll use that term ICE, meaning internal combustion engine. There's no toxic fumes inside the parking structures. One of the things I can tell you about is a lot of these older buildings have, by code, these ventilation systems that are in garages that often have old generators on them in case certain carbon monoxide levels hit a certain point. Then these engines click on, these really loud fans have to click on in order to be code compliant. And these things get old, they break, they fall apart, they're really difficult to maintain, and they're expensive for building owners. Well, if you have a building with a bunch of EVs in it, you're not going to have those kind of risks because you don't have toxic fumes. An installed EV charging infrastructure increases property value for owners. And if you're a property owner and you're at this seminar and you're wondering if this is really worth your time and effort, let alone potential expense, one thing to keep in mind is there is good data out there that if you have EV charging infrastructure in your building, it increases the resale value of your building and increases the value that you can charge for rent, and it increases just overall the worth of your entire operation. Home charging saves residents money over public charging options and is much cheaper than gasoline. This is a very important point that I'm not going to go into too much detail on, but I want to very quickly point out that this is an environmental justice issue. Right now, we're facing a world where the real challenge is getting the EV chargers into multifamily residential buildings. And that's because it's super easy to get it in a single family home. Single family homes almost always have enough capacity to put an EV charger in there. And sometimes somebody has to pay for a little bit of an update to their garage electricity system in order to do that. But generally, we're talking about something that's relatively inexpensive. And if you can afford a home, you can easily afford a charger in your garage. By the same token, really large commercial facilities, and I'm talking about buildings like, for those of you who are familiar with the Palms area, there's that massive structure on the corner of Sepulveda and Charnock that is, goes an entire block, and they have on-site management. It's run by a corporation, and those kind of buildings have their own charging facilities already in some cases. But even if they don't, adding chargers to those buildings is much easier because of the things we talked about in terms of having their own infrastructure. And so the cost there is also something that is easily overcome. So we get back to our reason of why it's so difficult to put it into small multifamily buildings and why that's so important we do this. If in 10 years from now, everybody's driving EVs and people in homes, single family homes, all can charge, and people who live in apartment buildings all have to go to some public charging facility, the people who are going to the public charging facilities will be paying more for the fuel to power their vehicles, that fuel being electricity. And we create an even further disparity in society because essentially you're getting cheaper fuel if you live in a single family home. So the rich people get richer, and the people who live in apartment buildings, which are more sustainable, arguably anyway, are actually going to be paying more just to fuel their vehicles. So it's really important that we make a level playing field for the entire wealth of society, and we create a situation where people in apartment buildings who are renters or condo livers or people in any kind of multifamily living situation have the same playing field as people who live in single family homes. Challenges facing these communities. So covered some of this a little bit already. Small multifamily buildings are often built with no anticipated electricity expansion, and existing electricity infrastructure will dictate how many chargers your building can support cost effectively. Some SMF buildings have little or no guest parking, making EV only charging spots impractical. In other words, let's say you have a building with 10 parking spots for the residents, and then you have that are designated, and then you have another 2 parking spots that are just for guests. Well, those kind of situations, you might want to put a charger in both those guest parkings, and then maybe your residents and guests could use those chargers. But oftentimes in Palms with these older buildings, and a lot of times throughout the country and in other parts of the world, we have a situation where there are actually fewer parking spaces in the building than there are residents or units. And it's actually the sustainability movement that's creating a downward pressure to have fewer parking spaces in buildings, often in transit friendly zones. And so we often have situations where you don't have extra parking spaces that you can just say, this is going to be a space for EV charging. So we'll talk about how you address that a little bit later. Installing less than 1 charger per housing unit can create conflicts in the building. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Chargers can be more expensive with power sharing technology, and many installers are not interested in working with small multifamily units because of the amount of work versus the amount of return. And the process can be slow, confusing, and frustrating. I'll go into detail on all these in a little bit. There is good news though. And that good news is if you live in Los Angeles and or if anybody who is essentially a customer of Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, they have a commercial EV charging rebate program. And it's sometimes also called Charge Up LA, that provides an extremely generous $4,000 for each level 2 charger that is installed through this program. That goes up to $5,000 if you're designated as a disadvantaged community. Palms is not within those zones, but if you do own a building or live in a building in those zones, there's even a higher incentive. The way it works is you are allowed 1 charger incentive credit for the first 2 parking spaces you have in your building and an additional incentive credit for each 4 spaces above that. So just to be super simple, let's say you have 6 parking spaces in your building. So that would mean you would qualify for $8,000 in a non-disadvantaged community. That would be 1 grant of $4,000 for the first 2 spaces and a second grant of $4,000 for the additional 4 spaces. Now, in a lot of situations, especially in that kind of situation where you're not talking about very many chargers and maybe the building can already support that, this kind of grant will easily pay for your entire situation. And as building owner, whether you're HOA or individual owner of a building, you're going to have next to no out of pocket. So this is kind of a no-brainer. It's like, do it, do it, do it, do it. So LADWP's program will put you into one of 3 categories. And this is where it starts to get a little complicated and you can get lost in the weeds. And that's why we put together this seminar, because if you just try to do this on your own, it's very easy to get discouraged at the hurdles you're going to be facing. A type 1 designation would be no upgrade is required for at least some of your chargers, for an installation with at least some chargers. And in those situations, you're almost always talking about if you get the rebate, the entire project is covered. And believe it or not, 90% of the projects that have gone through the program have qualified as a type 1. And so those are an awful lot of no-brainer buildings out there in terms of getting involved and doing this. Type 2, and just to give you a frame of reference, I was involved in living in a type 2 building myself, so it is much more complicated, but it's still very doable. And those buildings, there is a minor upgrade required. And that could be a panel upgrade, a service upgrade, and the cost can vary by situation, anywhere from nothing to maybe 15,000 bucks. 7% of the projects qualify for this. And then a type 3, which is new separate service required, where they have to run in a completely new line. Sometimes, almost always, this will kick in code upgrades where you have to build a separate building and things can just get astronomical. I mean, I know a lot of the projects that qualify for type 2 initially were told by electricians, oh, this is going to be a type 3 and it's going to be $300,000. And then those people just give up. Don't give up if somebody tells you it's a type 3. Go through the process of getting an installer who's willing to work with you to try to put together a proposal to try to make this a type 2, to work with the engineering crew and at LADWP and find a way to qualify for type 2. There are some buildings where type 3 is not necessarily cost prohibitive, and maybe it makes sense for your building, especially if you're looking at long-term upgrades of your infrastructure. It really depends on your situation. Now, to be very, very clear, when you hear about EV chargers, you will hear about 3 types of EV chargers. And those are not to be confused with this type 1, type 2, and type 3. They're called level 1 chargers, level 2 chargers, and level 3 chargers. So today we are only talking about level 2 chargers. A level 1 charger is sometimes called a trickle charger. Some people call them a granny charger. This is basically just in the United States, we have as our standard 110 volt power for household current. I know in Europe it's higher, but for the United States, that level 1 charger is a trickle charger. And that's just basically, the plugs in your bedroom that you plug your light into or something like that. All EVs that have ever existed can be charged that way, but it's a very impractical scenario if you're driving your car daily, because it takes like 2-3 days to charge the car sometimes. And it's just super, super slow. So we're not talking about that. That's not a practical application for EV chargers being put in somebody's garage. Level 3 chargers we're also not discussing today. Those are direct current chargers as opposed to alternating current, which is what household current is all set up on. Direct current chargers, there's sometimes called DC fast charging. This would be something like Tesla superchargers or EVgo or Electrify America's public charging stations. These are very high voltage direct current chargers that are very expensive. They cost as much as a car in some cases. They're a big deal, and they require a big infrastructure expense too. So we're not talking about those either. What we are discussing today is level 2 charging, which is 240 volt AC charging, which is the same as appliances in your home, household, residential service. So if you're talking about your HVAC system, or you're talking about, some people have electric dryers, some people have electric ranges, oven and ranges. Those kind of outlets that have the larger plugs, those kind of things are level 2. And that's what EV chargers for home use are. And in most situations, they're going to be able to charge up your car in 3 or 4 hours. They're not going to be a super fast thing like going to a supercharger where you can get done in 20 minutes. And they're more than enough practicality in them to be able to charge your car overnight. So that's the idea. For most people, you can drive an EV every single day, come home, plug in your vehicle, charge it overnight, and you're good to go. As EVs have adopted more and more range, a lot of the EVs that are being sold new on the market today are 250, 350, even more miles in terms of range. Those people are only charging, once every week or two, maybe, because they just don't use that much in their daily commute. So they don't even have to charge it, but they still can just charge overnight with an EV charger, and it's not a problem. There are some older EVs, like the early adopter EVs, that only had like 50, 60 miles of range. Those people might want to charge every single night just for their daily commute. But those vehicles are kind of, weird little anomalies that we're not going to see as many of going forward. So in order to do this, we decided to pick a sample building. And we picked a building in Palms, partly because Palms has a lot of buildings just like this. This is a 1981 build date on this building. It has 13 units. It's a good building for our purposes because it was built to 1981 specs in terms of electricity, not really done with any kind of upgrade in mind at the time. For very sake of simplicity, it has 30 parking spaces in the building. A rather generous 4 of these are designated for guests. So it's essentially, there's 13 units. Each unit has 2 parking spaces because they're 2-bedroom condos. And that's 26 spaces, then 4 additional spaces for guests. The original main for the entire building service is 600 amps. And each individual unit has a 90 amp sum panel. And if you don't know the difference between watts and amps or any of that kind of stuff, it's not super important for your purposes as an advocate, but for those who are, we wanted to include that information. The house common area is a 14th.
Sorry, Charles. I just noticed a question in the Q&A.
Sure.
And it was that 90% type 1 is that due to self-selection? It's a question from Fred in the chat.
That is, you could argue that that might be the case. And in fact, Fred, these small multifamily buildings are to some degree often discouraged once they call an installer or something like that. So LADWP doesn't have a good metric to find out how many people never get to the point of actually talking to them. But that is just those people who talk to them and asked to be evaluated for the process. So I'd say it's a fairly good number, but it's probably not quite as high as that 90%. However, I would say that if we took every single building in Los Angeles that falls into these categories, way over half are still going to qualify for that type 1. So it's not quite as, it may not be quite as high as 90, but there's no other metric in use that could give us a more accurate number right now. So we'll just find out as time goes on. The good news is LADWP has just recently announced that they're extra committed to trying to get more type 2 and type 3 installations into their process because those are the buildings that need the most help. So getting back to our sample building here, which has a typical electrical load use for its neighborhood and as a fully developed neighborhood with similar type buildings. Germane to your question, Fred, this is a building where they initially approached, this is an HOA condo building, and they initially approached the city and they were told by an installer, type 3, forget about it, this doesn't make sense, don't do it. And several different installers didn't even want to submit bids to it. This building ended up being a type 2 building. So it wasn't a type 1 building, but it did go through the type 2 process. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But even though I picked a building that's very simple because it's all 2-bedroom units and every unit has 2 parking spaces and it's kind of simple for our purposes, there are a lot of configurations out there of buildings that have all kinds of different bedrooms, all kinds of different parking, and every building has its own individual circumstances. In this building, the house common area is a 14th panel in addition to the 13 units, and it only had a 60 amp sub panel for the house power. Now that's very low, and you can't really run EV chargers on that. So the situation was definitely in need of an upgrade. And why would they have 60 amps for that common panel for the entire building and only 9, and when they had 90 amps for all the individual units? The reason is the common area was just basically powering lights in the courtyard, lights in the garage, and the garage gate, the electric garage gate that opens and closes when cars come. And, you know, for 40 years that worked fine. And that was all it ever needed. And so these buildings are built just to the exact spec of what they're intended to do. They don't put any upgrade in them in the system. Whereas single family homes often have a little bit of headroom, so upgrades can be done. That is generally not done on these mid-century single multifamily unit buildings. Okay, now getting to the layout of our sample building. As you can see, these red numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and up, that are inside the garage, those are parking spaces. And then you see spaces 28, 29, and 30 off into the back and the rear parking. Those are 3 guest parking spots. Just to give you the actual details of this building, that parking spot number 27, which is the first on the right when you come in off the street, is also designated as guest parking. There's a little storage room that takes up 1 space. Other than that, it's pretty straightforward. Each of the 13 units gets 2 parking spaces. So like unit A in the building gets spot number 1 and 2. Unit B gets spot number 3 and 4. All of this is serviced by an LADWP canister that is about 20 feet away from the back of the building, directly behind the building, and connects to the electrical housing cabinet in the back of the building, which is adjacent to that rear guest parking. So there are lots of options in terms of how we try to put chargers in a building like this. One option would be to go kind of on the smaller end, and this would be a 3 charger installation. So let's say you put 3 chargers in the building, you put them only in the existing guest parking. This would almost certainly, even with this older building, most buildings like this almost certainly could be a type 1 installation because you're only talking about 3 chargers. especially if you put a power sharing thing on them, so they're not all pulling the full load at once if they're all happen to be running at the same time. But even if they are, depends on the individual circumstances. But for this building, if you put power share on them, you probably could have done a type 1 installation and just put chargers in those 3 guest parking spots. These, if you use smart chargers, just very quickly, the difference between a dumb charger and a smart charger. A dumb charger, if you look at like, some of you might be familiar with the Tesla charger they sell on their website when they give you, that they offer you when you buy your car. The Ford has one that comes with the Mach-E kind of a thing. Those are essentially dumb chargers. They don't call them that because it's not a very favorable analogy, but they are, they're basically just a set of an outlet, a very fancy outlet with a little bit of safety equipment in it to make sure things don't burn down your building. They're not really keeping track of how much power they're giving you. That's all just charted through your normal power use, and you plug them in and all the power management is done by the software and the computers in the car that's doing the charging. These are super inexpensive relatively to everything else we're talking about. So if you see EV chargers advertised for like $500, $600, something like that, these are likely these dumb chargers, and that essentially means that they're just an outlet. So it's like just plugging it into your house, except you've got type 2 charging. So those are great if you live in a building by yourself or with just your family and nobody else is sharing your facility. But a smart charger is a much better solution for any kind of multifamily housing. And the reason being, smart chargers can talk to one another. Sometimes they do it through Ethernet or Wi-Fi, sometimes through Bluetooth. It depends on the setup. Sometimes they're hardwired together. Well, I guess I covered that in Ethernet. But smart chargers will essentially do power management. So if you upgrade a building like our sample building here, and you can upgrade it so it supports a new panel of say 200 amps, and you're supporting enough to run like 4 or 5 chargers, maybe 6 chargers or something at once kind of a thing. And if you wanted to have many more chargers than that, then smart chargers can talk to each other, and through different scenarios built into their software, they can pull everybody down to an even charge. They can put everybody in order and make people wait in a queue. They can say this charger is at the low end. This car is at the low end of its charge, so we're going to prioritize it. There's different ways smart chargers can work, but they communicate with one another, and they allow the system to be used safely to code, to electrical standards, to NEC standards, so that many chargers can be installed in the situation, and shared charging to make things safe for everyone. So in this particular situation for this building with older infrastructure and only the 60 amp house panel, you could probably put 3 chargers in here and have them be power shared. So you'd have 3 parking spaces in the back that could all be used. And then even though 60 amps wouldn't support all 3, they can be power shared so that they can work together to use only the available power. That does mean your charging times increase, but it's not enough to make level 2 impractical. So in this particular scenario, if only one of these chargers is going and it's going full blast, and you have a car that, the car probably charges in 3 to 4 hours, depending on the car, some a little bit faster. If you had all 3 of those chargers being used with the same car, suddenly that car might take 6 or 8 hours to charge, something like that. That's still plenty of time to do overnight charging. So as long as we stay in that window of like 10 or 8 hours or something like that or less, you're meeting the purposes of the multifamily resident, because they can charge overnight, and it's kind of seamless, and there's not a lot of difference between a 3-hour charge and an 8-hour charge in terms of how their use model will tend to dictate what things are. So in this scenario, these chargers would be installed as guest parking chargers, or you could call them EV only spaces if you wanted to eliminate the guest parking. In any way, in any scenario, if you're having people share chargers, it's less convenient for the EV owner residents. So let's say you live in apartment A and you have parking spaces number 1 and number 2. So you have a brand new EV that you got, and you want to charge it. You're going to have to take your EV out of spot number 2 and move it to spot 28, 29, or 30 and charge it back there. Okay, your vehicle is done in 4 hours, but maybe you don't want to bother to bring it back and put it in your spot. You can see once you get like 6 or 7 people in the building who have EVs, that there's potential for conflict here. Management has to be involved in this. You have to monitor who's using the spots, how long they're using it. Inevitably, somebody's not going to leave their spot when their vehicle is done charging, and there's potential for friction between the residents. There's potential for friction between the residents and the management, and there are potential problems. However, if you feel like maybe only 2 or 3 people are going to have EV chargers in the foreseeable EVs in the foreseeable future for your building, maybe this makes sense. There's still somewhat of a boost for being able to say your building has on-site EV charging. My personal opinion is only do this if the other scenarios just prove to be too expensive to you, because you want to create a scenario where you don't create internal conflict among the community where you're installing the chargers. Another thing you might want to consider is this could be done at low or almost no cost in any scenario if you qualify for the LADWP incentive program. However, you only get one bite of that apple. There's some discussion, I've talked to them recently about letting people maybe come back later and do a bigger second incentive. But as I understand the program right now, if you get an LADWP grant for your building and you take 3 chargers, 3 grants, you're now done. And you can't come back and say, you know what, I really wanted 8 chargers, and get a second bite at that apple. So that's a lot of cash you might be leaving on the table. And that's something to think about when you're picking your plan. So let's look at an 8 charger installation. This is what might be your most cost-effective installation, because this would be maxing out the most chargers you could get for your rebates with LADWP. And again, if you're not an LADWP client, stick with me on this because we're still covering things that's useful to you. But in particular, for LADWP people, you would be able to qualify for up to $32,000 for this building. How do we get to that number? Well, remember, you get $4,000 for your first 2 parking spaces, and then you get $4,000 again for each additional 4 spaces. So in this building, you would get $4,000 for the first 2, and then you would get an additional $28,000 for the next 28 spaces, getting you a total of 30 spaces and a total of $32,000 grant. That's a massive amount of money, as you can imagine. But it doesn't give you enough money for chargers that's only 8 grants, and each grant just produces 1 charger. So it's not enough money that it gives you chargers for all 30 spaces, obviously. But in this particular scenario, if we take those 8 chargers and we space them through the building, you can have a lot of your charging needs met. Now look at space number 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we know apartment A has spaces number 1 and 2, and and apartment B would have spaces 3 and 4. So in the foreseeable future, let's say A and B both get EVs, then you have up to 4 EVs that would be sharing 1 charger, and those 2 residents would have to coordinate amongst themselves, or there could be an HOA policy or apartment building policy that says, you know, if you're in an odd numbered apartment building, you get to use the chargers on an odd number day. If you're in an even number apartment, then you get to use the charger on an even number day. And because EVs have more and more range as time goes on, people can generally coordinate their lives and say, you know, I only get to charge on days that end with an odd number. No problem, I can do that. You're gonna have to switch if you have 2 EVs, you're gonna have to switch your parking around a little bit, so it's a little bit less convenient, but it's much, much better than that scenario where everybody's fighting over a couple of spots in the back, and you're only dealing with the relations between 2 units. You still have a potential for possibly having some friction between units. You know, somebody might leave their car charged in on the wrong day, plugged in the wrong day, and you know, you can see how there's still potential and management has to be involved. In this particular scenario, in this building, because of the layout, like those people who have parking spaces 16, 15, they got their own devoted charger, just kind of worked out that way. But this kind of scenario would very likely be covered entirely by that $32,000 in rebate that you could get, which is a massive infrastructure upgrade to your building, especially if it's type 1. And even if it's type 2, in most cases, that could be absorbed by the installer as part of the grant, because they would want the business in order to do an installation this size. So this is a great scenario if you're interested in this as an HOA or as a building owner or as an advocate to your own owner. If you live in the building, where you can go to your owner and say, hey, I can figure out how to get you chargers for a lot of people in the building, and you won't have to have any money out of pocket. This maximum charger installation plan is just a sweetheart of a deal. And let's be honest, most buildings don't have 100% EV adoption in 2022, and they probably won't for the near for the foreseeable future, to be for really the next 10 years. And so in that particular scenario, I know people get very attached to their parking spaces, and unit A, having spots 1 and 2, and unit B having spots 3 and 4. That might get a little, weird if you had to tell your residents to move to different spaces. But if the people in unit A say, I'm not getting an EV, I don't want an EV, never going to get an EV, and they're not going to do it. Well, if you could move spot number 2 that the unit A owner has and trade it with somebody who does have an EV, then you're putting more people next to the chargers. You get the idea. You'd have to work out the logistics of your individual building. But for this kind of an installation, you can almost certainly trade and move people around in parking spots and have it so everybody has access to a charger. Everybody has access to a charger in any scenario here, that they just have to share with their neighbor. But you might even be able to create a situation where nobody has to share with their neighbor in this kind of an installation. All right, so what's the Cadillac version of this? And I say Cadillac as a kind of an outdated kind of reference, but what's the deluxe version of this plan? Now, the deluxe version of this plan would be to set up chargers so that every individual apartment, every individual unit has its own devoted charger that only is being used by the people in that residence. This is the primo deal. This is the absolute best deal. This is the one that makes everybody happiest. If you're an HOA, every individual unit can say they have their own devoted charging. That's a property and value increase. If you're a building owner, you can advertise that to your residents that you have your own devoted charging. Anybody who's had an EV for any while will understand that devoted charging is a heck of a lot more appealing than having to share with other people. It also creates goodwill within the building because you don't have people fighting over, hey, I get it on Tuesday, you get it on Wednesday. And it encourages EV adoption. And even if you have people in the building who don't necessarily utilize this right away, they might appreciate knowing they have it because a friend might come over and they want to use the charger, and they can let them use their spot. And all that kind of stuff can be done in a way that doesn't create any conflict in the building.
Charles,
So
I've got another question.
Sure.
Oh, actually 2 that are, and this one's a really great one about landlords, because I think that's probably on a lot of our minds of how to get our landlords involved. But
right.
They ask, if a landlord is unconvinced and too busy to follow up, can a manager deal directly with LADWP to estimate what's possible? Or do you need to get a contractor involved in order to know how much it will cost and how much LADWP will offer?
That's one of the tricky things. To be truthful, LADWP is kind of cautious in giving you estimates as to whether or not you can definitely count on being type 1, type 2, or type 3 installation. They do not make that assessment until they actually see engineering plans. So it's hard to get a firm answer on that until an installer is brought into the process and they undergo the cost of creating an engineering plan that has to then be vetted by LADWP. So if you are a person who is managing a building and you have, I would say you already have access to your owner, get them to come to the next version of this seminar. We're going to try to do a couple more of them in 2022. They're free. We are going to try to keep a recorded version as well. So maybe you could show that version to them. Make it very clear to them that they're leaving money on the table that could increase their property value. And it's just foolish not to take advantage of this and to be an early adopter when they're essentially getting money to do it. This early adopter money might not be here in 10 years. And if they wait, they're going to have to do this anyway, because this is where the world is going. And this is what their tenants are going to be demanding. This will be like air conditioning. All of your tenants are going to expect it in 10 years. We're in like the 1930 version of air conditioning. Very few people have it. It seems a little exotic to people who own buildings. But by 1960, everybody, not everybody, I guess in LA, not everybody has air conditioning. You get my point though. It's coming, and it's going to be something that as a building owner, that person would want to and would eventually necessarily have to deal with. So I would say the best thing you can do is get them to come to one of these presentations and get them interested in the idea of increasing your property value at very little expense to them.
And
I
the
see
other-
David had a question here too. I'm looking at it. Do these chargers allow for scheduling charge times so as to take advantage of available peak power during the daytime? Let me cover that a little bit later, David. The answer is yes, but it's a little more complicated than just saying yes, because there are particular reasons for it. So let's get back to our 13 charger installation. Why you would want to do this? Well, remember, in this particular scenario, the LEDWP grant is only going to cover the cost of 8 chargers, but it also in that is covering the cost of the infrastructure. So one of the major expenses in this is not just upgrading the sub panel, it's running conduit throughout this entire garage and setting up stations where all the chargers can be installed. So if you did the 8 charger version of this garage and you didn't have them do the infrastructure so that it could support all 13 chargers, you're going to have a major expense later if you wanted to upgrade to those 13 chargers. And you're not going to be able to get more grants to do that. Whereas in this particular scenario, you're still going to get that you're still going to get that 32,000 grant to cover the first 8 chargers. But in doing so, have that installer build the infrastructure to support all 13. And that's about the same cost as doing it for the 8. It's not that much different if you do it all at the same time. And then you're only looking at the additional cost of smart chargers being installed for numbers 9 through 13. And in this scenario, those really shouldn't be more than about $2,000. So you're looking, and that's each. So you would be, as a building owner or as an HOA or something like that, you would be looking at maybe $8,000 to $10,000 out of pocket, assuming you qualified for level 1 or level 2, or I'm sorry, type 1 or type 2 with LEDWP. $8,000 to $10,000 is not that much out of pocket for a major infrastructure thing of your building that's going to increase your property value and greatly increase your appeal to tenants. And once you've done it, you've got it in place and everything is managed together on the same system, so you don't have to worry about it. So even though a lot of people may not be driving EVs in the next couple of years, you're future-proofed and you're not going to have to do this again. So that's a really good reason to consider that, because you built the infrastructure for 13 chargers. You don't even have to actually install the physical charger itself if you want to only install the 8 and just install the infrastructure for 13, and then maybe save some money today by saying, you know, I'm not going to do all 13 of the chargers till I actually need it, but I want the infrastructure in place. So it's just a matter of, you know, screwing them into the wall and installing them when the time comes. I think that's the smart future-proof way that a building owner and an HOA community would want to go. But, you know, this is such a generous program. It's absolutely worth doing, even if you just stick with the 8. Why smart chargers? Okay, so we covered the dumb smart thing a little bit earlier when I was talking about it, but essentially because these smart chargers can talk to one another, they share power, they manage it, they keep it a lot safer, and they can do it with less power. But the other thing these do is that they're connected to a billing service, and it makes it so you don't have people trying to use other people's chargers, and you don't have to set up. If we had a scenario in a building where everybody had their own panel and we had to hook up all the chargers to each individual panel, then every single panel in the building would have to be upgraded. This is each individual unit. It would just, the cost would be astronomical, and it just doesn't make sense in any scenario. But what these smart chargers can do, in addition to power sharing, is they have a billing apparatus that's set up with their own software. And most installers, nearly all installers that do this kind of installation, are set up to create a long-term maintenance agreement with you. And in that agreement, let's say you're in our sample building and you're in apartment A and you don't want to have any EVs and you don't want to use the charger. Okay, no problem, no expense to that tenant. But in unit B, those people have 2 EVs and they're very excited about it. And the unit A person who might be sharing a charger with them doesn't want to get charged for that. No problem, because they have billing services set up on your smartphone. It does mean that your tenants will have to have smartphones, but it's 2022. Most everybody does. And certainly anybody who's driving an EV is going to have a smartphone. And then they come up to the charger, they punch a couple buttons on their phone, and or punch on their screen a couple times on the phone. And it's set up with a billing service that's connected to a credit card for them. And they plug in the charger and the charger works because the phone gives it the green light to go. And then that person gets billed directly by the service. It's really convenient for a building owner or an HOA because you're not dealing with paying for everybody's electricity individually, or having to keep track of who uses what and who didn't use what. It's all run through the software. The company that does the billing provides a small surcharge for that, and then all of that comes out of the common area power for the billing, which the building does pay, but then you get reimbursed for all of that expense from the billing service. And the small surcharge that pays for the service is being paid by the individual user. So maybe it's like half a cent per kilowatt hour that the people in unit B are paying above the cost of electricity for the billing service. And that cost is not passed on to the HOA or to the building owner. It's all seamless in that respect. Owners also have the ability to add a surcharge to offset any cost of maintenance. You're going to have to set up Wi-Fi in your garage, and maybe that costs you like $50 a month. So if you put like a 0.25 cent kilowatt charge as a surcharge to offset your maintenance for everything, then that would easily cover the cost of that. I really want to discourage owners of buildings, be it HOAs or individual owners, from thinking of this as a revenue generating opportunity. A lot of unscrupulous businesses that promote installation of EV chargers are promoting it to building owners and say, hey, this is a great way to make EV charging a source of revenue in your building. I think that's a colossally bad idea. Number one, because of the environmental justice argument I presented to you earlier, where it essentially means people in apartments are paying way more for electricity than people who live in homes. But more importantly, it's going to be a big turnoff to your individual users, because they're going to realize that they're not gaining much as to going to a fast charger, and they're not gaining much versus another building where there's no surcharge being added. A lot of commercial spaces have gotten in the idea that they can add a significant surcharge to EV charging, and people end up paying as much or more than they're paying for gasoline, and it's kind of a ripoff. We want to encourage EVs. We want you to think of this as a way to increase the property value in the building, not a way to create extra revenue off of people who use EVs. The other cool thing about smart chargers is unauthorized use is prevented. Let's say you don't have a secure garage, or somebody gets in, or a guest gets in, or somebody pulls up and they just plug in. They're not going to be able to use it unless somebody in the building with an account plugs in and allows them to sign off on that charger. Theoretically, if they live in another building and the other building has the same system and they have their own account, then theoretically they could use it in those circumstances, but that's not really a problem anyway, because they're paying for it through their own system and you're still getting reimbursed for it through the billing service. It's not a problem. So best of all, people who don't drive EVs and are skeptical about this are not going to be affected in any way. So they, somebody who this puts up red flags for them, they can be rest assured. Did someone say something?
Oh, yes, that was me. There is a question that is, are any services that allow billing able to use a desktop browser for payments instead of smartphones? They said they could see 2 of their tenants who don't use smartphones potentially getting EVs when they get cheaper, or possibly getting a used model, which LADWP subsidizes. So
right. That's a good question. And frankly, I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that there are particular companies that sell, there's a company called ChargePoint that makes chargers that are dumb chargers, but they have a key on them. And they have a meter on them of how much is being used. So if you wanted to restrict that charger just for that individual person, and it had a key on it, so it could be turned on or off, and then that person could use it, and the meter would keep track of how much they used, then you would have to individually, as a building owner or as an HOA, bill that person for what they use. So I tend not to talk about it because I think it's a little more of a maintenance issue or an ongoing hassle for the people who run the building, as opposed to the seamless smartphone thing. But there are options that I know of in that category. In terms of doing it on the desktop, the problem would only be that the desktop has to be able to talk to the charger in the garage. if your garage charger is connected to the internet through Wi-Fi, I don't see why that's impossible, but I've not encountered a situation where anyone's done that. But I would say it's certainly theoretically feasible. Moving on, I'm going to tell you did I cover everything over here? I guess I did, yeah. Your installer is the most important choice you have to make. And this is something that I want to really underscore. For the sample building that we looked at earlier in the scenario, we contacted 25 different installers, and only 3 of them agreed to come look at this building, and only 2 of them submitted bids for it. Now, that was the first round. Now, if you can imagine, if you get that kind of unenthusiastic reply, that you are probably going to give up on this because you're going to be told, oh, that doesn't work for these kind of buildings. They're too much of a pain in the neck. I can't make any money on a building like that. I don't want to deal with the hassle of dealing with an HOA. I don't want to deal with the hassle of dealing with these old buildings with their old wiring. You can see how a lot of people could be easily discouraged from doing this. And that does happen, and it's happening a lot now. That's why we're doing this seminar. However, there are particular installers who have specialized in these kind of buildings. Why is it more expensive? Why would they say it's more expensive to them to do a building like this? Well, the argument is, if you're doing a building where you're only going to install 6 chargers, the cost of studying and doing an engineering plan for that building and going through the process of getting that engineering plan approved with a load calculation through LADWP is exactly the same than going through the same process in a building where you're installing 50 chargers in a big, massive commercial building or a large apartment building. And they remember, the grant is based on the number of chargers you're installing, so they can't make nearly as much money in that. That being said, there are boutique installers who have specialized in small multifamily buildings. I'm not going to name them on this because it's going to be something we're going to keep as a permanent record, and I don't want to endorse any particular one. But if you just go on the internet and search for them, you won't generally find them. You'll get the first 25 you find, which is what process I went through. And most of them will say, oh, I just do single family homes, or no, I don't want anything to do with a building like that. The best thing to do is to call the media people at the Charge Up LA program. Contact LADWP, ask to speak to some of the people who run the promotion for the project, and ask them to give you a list of companies that have successfully gone through the rebate program. The first thing they will say is, oh, we can't endorse anybody. We don't endorse anybody. So I'm not asking you to endorse anybody or recommend anybody. I'm just curious what companies have gone through the process as part of doing my due diligence. When they give you that list, that's your list. And you want to call those companies. And there are a good number of them. I know of at least 5 or 6 that specialize in exactly these type of buildings, and they do a bang up great job. And then you get your 3 bids. Go through the process of having them come out on site, figure out all the problems with you, tell them what you want to do. Don't let them discourage you from doing more chargers. Don't let them tell you that they want you to do something different than what you want to do. A lot of times, if you remember our diagram earlier, people would come out and they would look at a building like that and they would say, well, let's just install all 8 of the chargers in the spots that are immediately next to the power outlet in the back, because that's simplest for us and it's cheapest for us, and that's what we want to do. Don't do that with somebody if that's not what you want to do. Make them run the infrastructure through the entire garage and put the chargers where you want them because of the purposes for your building. That's very important. And if somebody doesn't want to do it the way you want to do it, don't work with that installer. Find an installer who is willing to welcome your uneducated questions and ask a lot of questions. And if the person is irritated or impatient with you or not willing to discuss it with you, don't work with that person. And also importantly, you want to make sure that you find the full proposal, not just the installation proposal, because the ongoing maintenance of this is going to be where a lot of these companies will make money, especially since they're doing the smaller installation, that there's not as much money for them to make. They can make the money on the back end through that billing service and an ongoing maintenance arrangement with you. So you'll create a contract with them that says, anytime one of your chargers die, our dudes will be out here in 24 hours or 48 hours or whatever, and we will fix it for you. And make sure that that you're getting a service that is reasonable and that you're comparing between the bids the cost of the ongoing maintenance program. How much are they charging for the billing? How much are they charging to do the maintenance? Are they providing the Wi-Fi? Some of these places want to install mobile phone towers in your building, and that maybe that's the best that works for your infrastructure. In other situations, the building itself probably has high-speed internet already for your residents. You can just add another account and have the building pay for that account. And it's a lot cheaper to do, high-speed internet through Spectrum or something like that than to set up a specific mobile phone cell tower kind of a situation. So every building has its own situations, but you want to make sure that you compare these proposals. That's why I say get at least 3 full bids, because you want them to be very specific. I'll be honest with you, bids can vary wildly too. Just for this building we talked about, the bids varied over $30,000 between the most expensive and the least expensive. And the least expensive was just a tiny bit more than the cost of the LADWP grant. And that was for a level, for a type 2 type installation, which is the more difficult type installation. So you can find people who are good to work with that understand that building an ongoing relationship with you is the most important thing. And, that's what you need to do, is find that good installer, because that's so key to the process of having a good experience through the entire experience. Some more tips. Commercial rate is required. So many small multifamily buildings built prior to 2000 were originally given a house common area panel on a residential rate designation. If you have access, if you're a building owner or an HOA officer and you have access to the billing for the common panel, mind you, this has nothing to do at all with individual bills for individual apartments, but the common area panel is usually noted as R1A or R1B if it's residential, or A1A or A1B if it is commercial. And you need to find that out. If it has an R at the beginning, it's residential, and you're going to need to get it switched to commercial. And as much as this seems like a simple thing, you have to contact the rate department at LADWP, and the process can take like 3 or 4 months. So this entire process of getting EVs in your house, just understand it's going to be a year of hassles, and it's not something that it's going to be a constant hassle, but you're going to be doing work and then waiting for the next bureaucratic peg to fall into place. So when you go to that rate department, they're going to say, oh, this might increase your rate, so we don't want to do it. The key thing here is that this is not something for you to worry about. For our case, or for our sample building, that building being built in 1981, it was put on a residential rate. And keep in mind that 60 amps panel that was there, that's only powering the lights in the garage and the garage door. So for that low load kind of situation, it actually is a cheaper rate on residential than commercial, which is why it was designated that way. But once you start putting EVs in the garage, you're going to be pulling a lot more power, because EVs are charging regularly and the load increases. And once you get up to a higher threshold of load, commercial could actually be a better deal than residential. You're not going to be paying more for the rate. Keep in mind that all of this is getting reimbursed to the building owner. All of this is getting reimbursed to the HOA anyway, because of the building scenario, because the users of the power are paying for the power and it's being reimbursed to you. So don't be afraid of this as something. Keep in mind, you cannot qualify for the LADWP grant program if you are not on a commercial rate. Next thing I would say is, once you pick your installer and you think you're looking cool, they're going to give you a contract. Go through that contract yourself and then go through it with your attorney. This is an extra expense, but if you're a good business person and a safe HOA, you'll want to do this anyway. I'll give you an example. A lot of these contracts have tons of boilerplate that won't apply to a small multifamily building. One of the contracts I saw, in one of the proposals I saw, said that the building is responsible for providing bathroom facilities to the entire work crew doing all of the work for all the time that they're on the grounds. And if they don't provide that, then the installer has the ability to charge them up to $500 a day to provide other facilities or something along those lines. Well, obviously that's done with a big commercial building in mind or a large scale apartment building that would have facilities. If you have a 6-unit building, no on-site management, 6 apartment buildings, you're not opening up your units, your apartments for the crew to use for a restroom. They'll probably have to bring out some kind of porta potty or some kind of situation like that for the 2 weeks that they have people doing this installation. But you want that kind of bad boilerplate taken out of your contract, and you want to make sure you're comfortable with what's in it. Time of use meters. And I'm going to cycle back to David's question here a little bit earlier where he said, can we set up things for in particular times? That kind of dovetails to time of use meters. If you go to LADWP's website, you'll see all kinds of information about using a time of use meter with a EV charger and how it can basically set it up so your EV charging is only happening at night. And if you use the time of use meter, you get a substantial 2.5 cents kilowatt hour discount. That's really cool in purpose, or in theory. In practical use, it really doesn't really work except for single family homeowners. And why is that? Well, because in order to do that, each individual charger has to have its own meter, which you're not going to do because you set up power sharing to avoid the cost of all that. You set up power sharing to avoid the cost of having separate panels, which you're not going to do. Generally, time of use as a time of use meter doesn't work as an option. Going back to our sample building though, this building has solar on it. And so what you might want to do is set it up so that people just use it during the day to use solar power. However, that creates some problems in and of itself. And the reason it creates those problems is because you're now putting a restriction on when people can use it. You're not allowing them to charge overnight, and charging overnight is when there's the least amount of peak charging demand anyway. It's the time when power is generally the cheapest for the building. So even though you're pulling off of grid, it's probably, and it's not necessarily guaranteed to be from renewable sources, it's probably better for everybody in the building. You don't want to create these barriers to EV adoption where somebody can only charge during a certain time. You might want to tell everybody in the building, say, hey, if you charge during peak solar hours, you're pulling right off the roof generally, and you're getting your powering your car with solar. But if you need to charge at night, you need to charge at night. And so you don't really want to put the HOA or the building owner or the management of the building in a position where it's trying to intervene that agenda and complicating things. We're just happy enough to get people in EVs in the first place. And if you live in LA, LA is aggressively moving towards having all renewable grid very, very soon. So the issue of renewability is kind of going away anyway. Now, if you have a building where you have your own off-grid solar that is set up that goes to its own power system and its own battery backup, then you can install some chargers to pull directly off of those batteries, but that's a whole other different thing. And if you know what I'm talking about on that, you probably don't need me to explain it to you. So
there's there's one question and one comment in the Q&A, Charles, if you want to take a look.
I found 3 installers for a single EV charger on Angie's list. There's Angie's list probably. Well, I did a lot more exhaustive search on Google, and I found a lot more options. They do exist, but I'm not going to. But rather than telling you who to contact, I can personally one-on-one talk to you about that if you want, or I would say contact the Charge Up LA, the commercial EV rebate charger program at LADWP, and ask them for contacts for a list of names of companies that have successfully navigated this rebate program before. They won't necessarily get back to you right away, but within 48 hours they will, and they will be delighted to give you that information as long as you make sure you understand and acknowledge that you're not asking for a recommendation or an endorsement. Let's see, for older buildings that don't have the electrical service capacity, are DWP and Building and Safety allowing a separate service to be added for EV chargers, or are they forcing an upgrade of existing systems? That's an interesting question. That if you have that new separate service, that immediately kicks in a type 3 installation. So sure, that's ideal, but it can cost your building $300,000. And once you do that on a building, you're now looking at 2022 code. And so the 1980s, 70s, 60s, 50s buildings, none of their electrical closets will meet that. They're all grandfathered in. But if you bring in new separate service, you have to build out an entirely new building to power all of that that has to meet code. You'll probably lose a parking space just to have the space to do that. So that's why that gets so expensive and is so cost prohibitive. So it really makes more sense to everybody if they can do, if they can work with the existing system. But that being said, type 2 means that you're going to have a panel upgrade. So in our sample building, it was the house panel current was upgraded from 60 amps to 200 amps. A new power line was pulled from that LADWP canister, a new power cable, and brought to the building and plugged in to the existing infrastructure 600 amp main, and then a new 200 amp sub panel just for the EVs was installed. So all of that was type 2, and all of that meant extra costs for the installer in terms of labor, but LADWP paid for the cost of that cable, paid for the cost of everything coming up to the building as an upgrade in order to support this program and to support this process. And so that type 2 installation ended up being largely absorbed by LADWP and the installer. So it's definitely the way you want to go if it's necessary to do that, as opposed to a type 3, which kicks in all those code upgrades. Anonymous, let's see, can confirm time of use of meter stuff. However, if the attached meter is the newer digital kind, it does aid in taking advantage of standard night charging rates or so. Yeah, that's absolutely true. But they put digital meters on that are on, everything's going to digital meters, regardless of whether or not they're TOU meters. And so in the building in question, they're absolutely going to put a digital meter on there to keep track of the house power. And so you can keep track of that through the digital meter anyway, without it being time of use. Time of use is a separate specific type of meter that keeps track of the exact time that it's being used and feeds that back through software to LADWP. That's a little different. You have to have a devoted meter, not for the entire house, but just for the EVs. And that's why it becomes a problem necessarily for time of use. It's just an option that we can't really pursue in multifamily, even though it maybe someday, maybe soon someone will solve that problem. So please ask about it. Ask LADWP about it. Ask your installer about it. Just don't expect that to be something that you're going to be able to take advantage of anytime soon. Okay, I think that's it. So I just want to quickly acknowledge the people on this page. Jasmine Arceo is a great name for you to write down. She is part of the team at Charge Up, and she's the person you could call at LADWP to ask about, can you give me a list of installers that have successfully navigated your program? She's not an engineer. She's not an electrician. She's somebody who works to promote this program. So that this is completely in her wheelhouse. There's other people too, but she helped me a lot, so I'm throwing her name up here. They have an EV service design team and an engineering team. These people that I listed here were super helpful in helping us go through the process. That's a separate department. I want to thank Councilmember Koretz and especially Andy Schrader, who is his environmental sustainability director. I want to thank Lisa Hart and the LA Neighborhood Council Sustainability Alliance, and PNC, of course, Jesselyn and Helen, and Green Water and Power. Danny Gold is an electrician who helped me vet some of this, and UCLA Sustainability Program helped me go through some of this. The head of that program is Narit Katz. I'll just go out of here, come out of the screen sharing now, and let's see, how do I come back to, how do I turn off screen sharing? Pause share?
The
Yeah.
little, oh wait, let's see.
Yeah, I think pause sharing should do it, hopefully.
There we go. I found a little red button that says stop share.
Right.
Okay, folks. That's the basics of it. Hopefully I actually provided you with some useful information. Some people are still sticking around, I see over on the list. So thank you very much for coming. If you have some more questions, now's the time to answer them. I see Someone's talking about Ted Reinhardt. Yes, I know Ted from LADWP was helpful in single EV charger installation in multifamily. Ted is actually the guy who will come out most likely. And once everything is set up, he's the one who has to sign off on the permit from LADWP side. And there's building and safety people that have to sign up on the permits. There are other people involved, but yeah, all these people who are in these positions, sometimes they're busy, sometimes they're impatient with you, but they do care about this and they see the wisdom of what we're doing and do support this this initiative. So so use the good people out there, understand it takes time, don't take no for an answer, and don't let somebody tell you it's impossible if you haven't confirmed that multiple times from multiple people, because generally you can do what you want to do. You just have to find somebody who's interested in doing it the way you want to do it.
So it looks like there's some more questions coming in. Also at this point, I believe the attendees, if you'd like to raise your hand versus posting the questions, feel free to do that too. We will be posting the recording of this event after this is done. It'll be up on our website. We just need to pull the video from Zoom and get it put up there. So if anybody wants references, we didn't talk about this beforehand, but I think we might want to send the attendees who are willing just a quick survey for any feedback. I know we got at least one really good suggestion in the Q&A for creating a shorter version, potentially for building owners. So, if there are any other suggestions folks have, we'd love to get your feedback. This is the first time we did this. But yeah, any additional questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A or raise your hand, and I'll let Charles address that one from the anonymous attendee in the questions. I see that. Okay. Okay. To be clear, LADWP is not paying a percentage of any installation. So the 90%, if you got that from me, then I miscommunicated or you misunderstood me. They are paying a set number of $4,000 grants based on how many parking spaces you have. And that's never going to be enough to give every single person a charger in your building, because it's every 4 spaces. And so in no building I know in LA does every apartment unit have 4 spaces. So the grant can be for a 50 unit building, then if you probably have many more parking spaces. And so that would be many more $4,000 grants that are stacked up on top of that. The key to all this is that $4,000 is enough to pay the installer more than they need to pay for the charger, because you're paying for the installation of the infrastructure. You're paying for all the conduit, all the new wires, and those copper wires are everywhere. You're paying for the panel upgrade. You're paying for the adjustments to the main of the building. You're paying for all of those things, all the new breakers and the new box. All of that stuff is kind of factored into the idea that the bigger it gets, the more that's going to cost. And this $4,000 is going to more than pay for the $1,500 to $2,000 smart charger, plus the expenses involved with it. So actually it works at scale really favorably. So if you have a larger building, let's say a 50 unit building, the number of grants you have is going, the more grants you get, the more gap there is between the more money there is between the cost of the chargers and the amount of money that's going toward infrastructure and other stuff that the installer is getting, the more profit that they're realizing. You still have the limit of you only get the number of chargers that fit to the grant. And so if you wanted to go for like every 2 parking spots instead of every 4 spots, you're still going to look at out-of-pocket expenses for those additional chargers. But I still, in any scenario, would recommend that you focus on getting infrastructure built out for the entire building when you're doing that, even if you're not installing chargers more than the grants support right at that time. And that way you're future-proofing your installation. Any more questions? Well, I think we're about ready to wrap it up. Helen, Jessalyn, thank you very much for doing this with me, and for missing out on that football game that Jessalyn wanted to see, and just for spending your time here and supporting this and getting behind it. I tend to ramble and I tend to go on, but I want to put out there
that you can contact the PNC if you want to follow up on this. Also, my email, if anybody, this is a small enough group, my email is Charles Allen, ALLEN Miller@gmail.com. If anybody wants to contact me directly, please feel free to do so. And I know this is being publicly posted, so if I get spam, it is what it is. But I'm happy to talk about this issue. Obviously, I'm passionate about it and care about it. Nobody's paying me to do this. I don't install chargers for a living. And I just want to see more people get into sustainable transportation if possible. So I'm going to give it back to the ladies and signing off from here. Thank you guys very much for attending.
All right, there is one last question, and I don't know if this is too big of a question about the math on a 50-unit building. If that's something that you might want to follow up in a conversation after this, or
it really depends on, yeah, it really depends on the number of parking spots. So yeah, I can do the math if you tell me how many parking spots, but sometimes 50-unit buildings have a lot of studio apartments in them that have no parking, or they have, if they're all 2-bedroom units and they all have 2 spaces and there's no guest parking, that's 100 units, right? So you would get one $4,000 grant for the first 2 units, and then you'd have 98. So 98 divided by 4, what's that? 98 divided by 4, should have done it in my head. That's 24 and a half. So that's 24 additional grants. So that would be a total of 25 grants times $4,000, which is $100,000 grant right there. So in that particular scenario, based on those assumptions, that's $100,000 easily that would pay to put in the cost of 25 chargers, 26 chargers in this case, was it? And whatever it was, 25, yeah. 25 chargers that you could space out through the building, but you might want to make it so that the building supports 50 chargers so that you have every individual apartment unit, all 50 of your units, future-proofed so that the infrastructure is there. And as more and more EVs are purchased in the future, you can just at that time spend the extra money, the extra $1,500, or maybe they'll be cheaper in 5 years to put in another smart charger and add it to your system, because your infrastructure supports 50 chargers, not just the 25 that were done as part of the grant. So, but frankly, if you're getting $100,000 to do it, you probably can put in more than 25 chargers by just working out a deal with your installer to throw in more chargers as part of the deal, because there's a bigger payday for them involved in that scenario.
And another question on tandem spaces, how they're calculated in this. As I understand it, tandem would count for 2. If 2 cars go in the space, it counts as 2 spaces. So you'd be good to go on getting 2 there. Obviously, you're not going to put a charger anywhere to service the car that's not in the front. So the one that's against the wall would be the only one that would be serviced by an EV charger. But I believe tandem spaces count as 2. Don't quote me on that. That would be a good question for the LEDWP charger program. Okay, I think we're done. Anonymous has stopped asking questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. And thank you so much, Charles, for being here. Thanks. Yeah, it is really helpful to hear what questions folks have so that we can tailor this in the future and, hopefully continue to expand and grow the program. So thank you so much to Charles for bringing the idea forward to the Green Committee. We're glad to support you with this. And we haven't announced dates for future presentations yet, but we will be talking about that soon. So stay tuned on our social media and our website for additional dates when we'll be doing this again. Jessalyn, did you have anything else?
No, thank you so much, Charles. That was awesome, really informative. And I think, really excited to see what we can get going in Palms with this information and using what you've learned and know. So yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to click on stop recording.